high tech.
Okay, I guess we'll turn it over to our engineering firm to do their little presentation here for the commission work so far.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. My name is George Fowler. I've been involved with this project since the beginning. I lead up the technical assessment part and also do the facilitation. So there's a seamless approach between people sitting behind the computers and doing all this heavily modeling to actually facilitating this information. So feel free if you have any technical questions, ask tonight, and I'll try my best to answer those. So tonight I think we have a few extra hard copy of the presentation in case we can't see it on the screen. So if you need one, feel free to grab one up here. Our goals tonight are twofold. The first one is for the boards to understand what the problems are, such as inundation hazards within our study area, and then also to recognize where those are, understand what the vastness of our inundation hazards or flooding problems are, and then also for the boards and the public to understand some of the what these inundation hazards cause, not just in damage, but in terms of financial damage, such as higher flood insurance premiums or the value of home prices being stagnated because they're in a flood zone. So as we're going through these exercises, just keep those in your mind as to understand what exactly these flooding hazards are and where they're located and why that's important to the community. But also the financial part about it is like knowing the entire scope of this and how people's day-to-day lives can be impacted in terms of if they need flood insurance, if they have to get a mortgage, or if they're trying to sell their home, what that may do to home prices. So keep that in the back of their mind as we're going through this. And lastly, how our existing flooding hazards may impede our future growth, such as economic growth, or new residences, or infrastructure. So as we're walking through and looking at the hazards and where they are located, how that may impact what Delhi may look like in 15 and 20 years from now. So the second outcome, the second understanding I want to goal for tonight is as we're walking through these mitigation strategies, think about what would the community actually want these benefits. We're going to go through and look at mitigation strategies that involve removing fill from some places, moving buildings from others, and all that is going to lead up to a reduction in water surface elevations during a flood. So what we're trying to do is shrink the vastness of the flooding through these various exercises. And so that's benefit. If we can remove homes out of the flood hazard zones so they don't necessarily need flood insurance, and then their home prices can actually reflect market value, those are benefits. But it comes at an expense of temporary and permanent impacts. Moving fill from one place and never putting it back, that's a permanent impact, or there may be construction. So as we're going through these mitigation strategies, think about that. Will the community who I represent really find this strategy palatable? Because that's who this is all for, is your community. There may be some strategies out there that we'll go through tonight that maybe just look like totally out of left field. Frankly, there's an athletic field that we're looking at, so it's a good analogy. It's but you see the benefits from it, and so we have to weigh what we gain from what we have to go through to get there. And then lastly, the thing to think about is some of these mitigation strategies call for relocating things. That's a big term in this mitigation strategy, is actually not buyout, so people leave the community. We want to protect the community's tax base. So one of the more favorable programs that's available is relocation. And when we say moving something out of the flood zone, the program is designed, it's a willing buyer, willing seller, willing community. And so the buyer has to move to someplace within the community so to preserve the tax base. So when we talk about relocating buildings, we don't want those residents to leave the community. We want their presence to be felt and their tax dollars to be enjoyed by all. So that's one thing, is that when we start proposing moving buildings or infrastructure, is there a place for them to go? Do we have enough open lots in town to move certain buildings or commercial buildings, or athletic fields? And if there isn't, what do we need to do to get there if this is actually a viable mitigation strategy? So that's the last thing to think about as we're going through these mitigation strategies. So I'm going to we're going to go through a lot, and I'm going to try to wrap up as quick as I can. So I've always liked to start the meetings by saying what we have accomplished since the last meeting. We've had 2 flood commission meetings, and the way this works is Lloyd Engineering, who I work for, and sometimes get a paycheck from, we work with the flood commission. We run all of these, we solicit ideas from them, we have solicited ideas from the community. We start going through those ideas and see if they're actually technically viable, and then we generate other ideas from our technical assessments of the surrounding area, and then we go back and forth. We work together as a team to develop these ideas and vet them, and what we're going to go through tonight is just a fraction of all the ideas we've already gone through. We've already jettisoned some ideas that we didn't think were palatable for either technical reasons, financial reasons, community reasons. So we've already had 2 of those meetings to get to this place tonight. There are 5 5 study areas in this overall local flood analysis area. They are in order from north to south: Elk Creek, West Branch, Delaware, Meredith Street, Steel Brook, and then the Little Delaware. So we've gone through 5 areas and identified flooding hazards, and most of those areas, Little Delaware, we didn't really find anything of note that we were furthering forward. And then at the end, we developed these mitigation alternatives for things that had flood hazards within those areas. So this is going to be really hard to read, but I want to show you just kind of in a chronological order where we are in this entire process and where we're going. So these are basically major milestones in our project, and we're starting to get past the 50% mark into the final red zone, if you will, since football season has started. And at the end is a local flood hazard mitigation plan, which is the roadmap to Delhi's flood mitigation strategy. So in it, we'll have all of the steps covered that we started from the beginning to the end, and really at the end is going to be this table of mitigation strategies that were ranked highest priority to lowest priority, and they're ranked based on feedback from the Flood Commission and the community and a little bit of other variables that go into it, like benefit to cost ratio, and that's what's going to end up in this final row 14 here, is this roadmap to flood mitigation. And this roadmap will then allow the community to go out and seek money to fulfill these programs. And these pots of money are available now through the Catskill Water Corporation, through DEP, and they are going to be funding, but in order to get access to that money, we have to complete this LFA, local flood analysis process. So that's where we're heading. All right, so the first up is Steel Brook. Steel Brook is this side of the building, and we were charged with looking at the flooding problems from the confluence all the way up about 3 miles upstream. And what it boiled down to is the main problem was right here at Main Street and Elm Street crossings. This exhibit shows, it's a profile, and so a profile is looking, if you were standing on the stream and looking downstream, this is what one would see. If you were to walk down the stream, this is where your boots would be on the stream bottom. And these blue lines are water surface elevations during a flood. And these are calculated based on some software modeling program that we use, which is approved by FEMA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's a very common software program that we use. And so the top line here is your 100-year water surface elevation. A 100-year flood is statistically a flood that happens 1 every 100 years. Now you could have 2 100-year floods in a 5-year period, but then statistically you won't have one for a long, long time after that. And then the lowest line is the water surface at the 2-year flood, so a more common flood. So what we're seeing here is that at the Main Street Bridge, we start running into hydraulic insufficiency, so the bridge starts to overtop at very large floods. And at more common floods, we see things passing through here. But at the Elm Street crossing, this is the pedestrian bridge in Elm Street, this is the vehicle bridge, it's overtopped quite frequently. Now the Flood Commission's concern was with the Main Street is that it gets clogged up, and when it gets clogged up, water goes everywhere, as we see in 2006 and a couple other floods. And so we remodeled that and saw that if this particular bridge at Main Street were plugged about only 50%, that 25-year would no longer pass through, would pop over, and even the 10-year, which is this is the 10-year right here, that actually pops over. And so a very frequent flood event, when it's plugged with either logs or rocks, the water will go everywhere. So we were asked to develop a strategy to prevent that plugging from happening. So we did an assessment. We walked up Steel Brook all the way for about 4.5 miles or so. And what we do is we're looking for opportunities to prevent flood debris from coming down and plugging Main Street. And how we approach our flood mitigation strategies is we have a tiered system. This is how wood engineering approaches it. There's probably other approaches out here. But what we like to do is start with like the kind of the green infrastructure practices and look at, say, if we can reduce flood discharges, actually reduce the volume of water from coming in and causing the problems. Those are our green ones. And then all the way down to the end where we start talking about actually moving buildings around, which we feel is a very invasive procedure. And so in Steel Brook, we moved out of the green infrastructure practices because they weren't technically feasible into perhaps this dam or retention ponds or debris capture basins in the stream. And in this map here, this is Steel Brook going down through here. And what these color lines represent is the amount of flood debris that could actually get hung up on Main Street, which is right down in here. And the red lines are extreme, is really tall banks with a lot of trees overhanging that they're eroding very problematically, all the way down to the blue ones, which have no flood debris sources. So we're proposing here on this mitigation strategy called 2B is to do a combination of stabilizing these flood debris sources and also looking at potentially capturing some of this debris upstream of Main Street. So there's two old dams up here. One is the abandoned drinking water reservoir that used to supply the municipality's water. And then further downstream is this historic dam site where you have this vertical stone wall right here, and then over on this side of the valley is this old earthen dam. So it used to be some kind of mill-run dam. And coincidentally, that's where we see between the two the highest amount of flood debris problems, which is not surprising because usually with dams, especially dams that are no longer active, you see a lot of eroding banks and flooding debris. So we were looking at potentially capturing debris in these two sites here while strategically stabilizing some of these flood debris sources. So that's number 2B there, Steel Brook 2B. Then we move in our next tier of more invasive strategies, which are site-specific mitigation strategies. So that's where we're coming down to where the flooding hazard actually exists. So here's Steel Brook here flowing this direction. This is where I'm trying to put you all to sleep tonight, right in this building here, and the Main Street and obviously Elm Street. So as I said before, things to keep in mind and when we go through these strategies is what are our benefits? Well, these pins right here represent homes that are in what's called the Special Flood Hazard Area, SFHA. I'll throw that acronym out a couple times tonight. And what that means is if anyone's trying to purchase a home within an SFHA and they want a federally backed mortgage, which most of the mortgages are, you'll need to get flood insurance. And if you've been seeing some of the current events, flood insurance premiums are just going up. And they're going to go up notably over the next several years. So the other part of that for these homes that are on these push pins here are also their home prices. If a person has a choice between home A and home B, and home A is in a special flood hazard area where it's known to flood, and they need flood home insurance, and home B is the same kind of equivalent house, but it's not within a special flood hazard area, what do you think that buyer is going to buy? They're going to go for B. And so then the person with home A, their housing prices aren't going to reflect the natural market because they have this label that they're in this zone. So these are things that we're talking about with these mitigation strategies. If we can remove these people's homes and the flags here are businesses out of the special flood hazard area, either through some remapping exercises that we'll talk to you about in a second, or through some kind of construction activity, then we're getting a benefit. So we're here now and we're looking at, well, what if we were to increase the width of the channel, starting right about here where that riprap job is, right on this slope right through here, all the way down past the town hall, and increase the channel width and all the bridges. We saw earlier that the Main Street Bridge, when it gets plugged, it starts overflowing and water starts shooting down this way. It starts, especially here in Elm Street, starts shooting down the road this way and down this way. So what we're trying to avoid is that happening. So to do that, we widen the bridge. Also, we get a benefit is that if we widen the Elm Street Bridge and combine the pedestrian and the vehicle bridge, keep them separated as their own two lanes, but combine them and widen them, we find that we start passing all of these flows. So if we increase the clear span at the Main Street Bridge and the Elm Street Bridge and take this natural channel, this channel that's 12 feet wide and increase it 13 feet wide and increase it to 30 feet, we really start passing all of our flows and our debris problem goes away. So this is this is right in your backyard. It's a little bit more invasive, but it still gets the job done. And so what does this do? So this is a cross section. So this is basically a scalpel view right across here. This is the left side, and then this is the right side through here. So if we move the bridge 17 feet this way, we start passing the 100-year flow, even with the obstruction in place. So it's a really important take-home message that you can get a major flood in through here, and half the bridge before it could be plugged, but we still are passing all our flood flows, so we have no more water going down this way or popping out any other place, and no more water up on Elm Street. So that will require a little bit of moving things around. We looked at doing the right bank here because on the left bank we had too many homes right up against the stream bank here. So in this one, we would have to relocate, I believe assume this house right here is relocated. That would be the only building that would have to be relocated out of the way. And that's what this would look like. We could be able to grade this down, open this up 17 feet. The next house downstream, we'd be able to remain in place. So that would be this Steelbrook alternative 3B through here. And we're still passing all of it. And as you move downstream, just another comparison, before your water surface elevation under existing conditions was getting out of the floodplain, and now it's still being contained within the channel. So that is one other strategy to help with the flooding problems associated with here. Now, what are some of our benefits? Again, this is what Elm Street would look like. That brown line is what the existing clear span is, and then we've moved it back 17 feet, opened it up, and now we're able to pass all the flood flows through there. So what does that do? Well, it now alleviates all of the flooding problems. Any of the flooding problems that were going and getting these homes wet, all of these push pins through here, and these businesses that were potentially getting wet from this insufficient capacity at Elm Street, no longer. You can see this line here. This is, again, a profile through, and this is our existing water surface elevations during the 100-year. This is going up and over the bridge, and going and spreading out across the homes. Now with that intervention, it's all passing through, and no homes are getting wet. So with a what's called a LOMAR, letter of map revision, if this were to be completed, we can then pull all of those homes and businesses out of the SFHA, and then the insurance premiums, if they have them, go down notably. So any questions on those interventions at all?
Just a couple points. The one reason why the Flood Commission had them run the blocks on the bridges is the FEMA model actually considers flood water clear water. There's no debris in the water itself when it's modeled. So it's modeled as if it was clean water, no trees, no sediment, anything like that. So we had to actually ask it to plug half the bridge, which is more representative of what happens during your floods. As you guys mobilize excavators there to pull logs out, things like that, those are all the debris jams he's talking about. I think no matter what, you're going to have a combination of approaches. the first approach of how do you shut the sediment source off and how do you shut the tree debris source off in Steel Brook itself, upstream of it, I still think would have to happen even if this combination went into effect. Because you don't know if it's going to be just 50% of the bridge being plugged by a massive slide upstream, things like that, and that debris coming down through. So I think still you're going to have to use both approaches to make sure that the community is in its best situation going forward. So I think out of this, we talked about where does the LFA stop and where does a new process begin. I think they've laid out a good plan for what we need to do on Steel Brook, and now we can actually retask that as a management plan for Steel Brook for woody debris and sediment debris, and really drill down in to the point where you have active designs for each one of the identified slopes and what the fixes could be for those, and then seek dollars to actually implement those as well. I would see both of those happening probably simultaneously, but the sooner we start picking up and doing an actual management plan for Steel Brook, the better you are going forward. So just in our vision from Soil and Water, we just see it as happening probably both. You're probably gonna consider both alternatives or pieces of it as you move forward and the community's ready and your citizens are ready. But that's a big gain to pull all those houses and those businesses out of that special flood hazard area. That's a pretty big gain for just changing your channel shape by 13 feet.
But wasn't it about, just 10 years ago when both boards met, we talked about, stream bank remediation, which is still on hold
Stream bank remediation for Steel Brook.
for Steel Brook.
Yeah, so the management plan would be exactly that, down to the actual design level too. So I think that this is clearly put the science to say Steel Brook has got the sediment load that is causing all of these issues. So now write the prescription for how do you treat it right down to the engineering costs, and then get the funding for those slopes. Because they're water quality impairment. They are obviously a flood hazard coming through the municipality. So there's a lot of reasons why, if you line that up correctly, the plan's basically gonna say which banks do you attack first and how do you attack them, and then put the engineering behind
Right.
them.
But, like you say, Steel Brook has been in the, let's say, the drawing boards with
Yeah.
Soil and Water for 10 years.
Okay. I don't think that anybody's ever taken an approach where we've actually designed anything on Steel
No,
Brook.
I know, you've done
Yep.
your survey and
Yep.
stuff, but are we, obviously this is one measure of going through.
Yep.
But if stream bank remediation has been involved with Soil and Water for 10 years, where are we with that process?
This is built upon every one of those slopes that we already had measured in there,
Mhm.
and this is gonna write the prescription for it, for what actually has to happen there.
Okay.
So I can't predate myself in the program as to where it is or how it is, but this is the linear path with all the science behind it, saying this is the answer you need to go to for all of these reasons. And that opens up the funding to it. So you're not looking at a 10-year program again. You're looking at, here's exactly why we need it, here's why it needs to be on the front burner for somebody. And the commission knows that we already have 3 consultants on retainer through the Soil and Water Conservation District, that we actually just need to make a selection based on the 2 boards. We'll give you the 3 consultants we have on staff and say, which one do you want to progress this forward now? We actually have those contracts in place. So now our next step, using this science, is to say, who do you want to do it? And then we task order them. They can literally start that process now.
And we have 3 bridges actually on Steel Brook. Nothing's been mentioned about Williston Street Bridge, which is the smallest bridge of all 3.
Right, and that one, we did not see, even at the 100-year, it overtopping the bridge. So from a flood inundation hazard, nothing was popping out on the modeling exercise on that one there. Now, we are conscientious of that there's been some failures of, around the abutment of the bridge, there's been some failing up through there. But through our communication with the Flood Commission, that was not identified as an area that needed any kind of mitigation alternatives because it was passing all the flood water and it wasn't prone to flood debris plugging as what we see downstream here at Main Street. So that's why you didn't see that here. But we did go through that, and as in the beginning of our presentation.
I think just the size of the root ball, whatever comes down, because it's very tall. I'd say the bridge is higher than the other bridges, but it's a narrow bridge.
And that was the discussion, we've had that discussion, and I didn't know it was off the table. I guess I'm a little confused being on the commission.
That was
that
mentioned
was,
to be on. That was still on the table.
Yeah,
Because we
because-
discussed it. I've got pictures of it.
Yeah.
25-year event where it's 4 inches to the core.
And because it narrows down, we talked about the speed at which the
Yep.
water leaves and the damage that it causes on the downstream side of the bridge, because it all narrowed up there.
Right.
So there's still two approaches we can take with that. First of all, we can do the scenario where it's blocked, and you can go through that modeling again and say, assume the same exact situations, where does it go, what does it go? Even if that comes back and says the scope of the LFA has got a very direct scope as to flood inundation hazards and how that all works, even if it doesn't go through that cut right there, the management plan still can pick up that bridge and say, okay, we feel like we need to mitigate velocities because it's on bedrock, you're gonna lose your left bank like you have several times in the past with the walls. You could still get a prescription out of this whole process to do that. Even if the LFA doesn't specifically say this causes flood inundation hazards, there's other things that are at play still with that bridge. And all the things we've talked about in the commission. So the first task we'll do is we'll say, what were the assumptions on that, so everybody's clear on that again with the model, and then relook at that. And if right, wrong, or indifferent, if it says that it's not causing an inundation based on those things, it's still not a dead subject. We still can bring that back up in the overall plan of what you're gonna do with Steel Brook.
In our experience with the LFA process, we've had this with other communities where there are areas, bridges in particular, that have been flagged as very big concerns with the community. There's one in West Shokin that we're working on, and we try to plug it up 60%. Couldn't get the waters to overtop the bridge because it's such a wide bridge and such a lot of capacity through it. But it's eroding. But underneath the LFA, the abutments is undermined and it's really bad shape. But underneath the LFA process, there's programmatic guidelines to say what can be furthered into recommendations that would be guided with the LFA. And then once we reach that line, then we say, okay, here is the problem. This is the problem with the West Shokin Bridge, or in Woolerton, if we can't find an inundation hazard here, here's a known problem. And then someone else in a different program picks it up and runs with it for conceptual design, et cetera, like that. So we're a little bit guided a little bit what we can do in the LFA process, but the point is that we're in this process, we hear what the community is saying, say here's a problem. It may be an inundation hazard, or it may not be. If it's an inundation hazard, then we can further it through the LFA program. If it's not, it's still a problem, so then someone else can pick it up and go down through, and we're working with Soil and Water and the Flood Commission to do that.
And now we have a good opportunity, like I said, we don't have to have this thing done, complete, wait, and then start another process. We don't have to do that. We actually have all that stuff in place now with contracts. So we'll have to sit down and say, how do we make the selection of who you want for a consultant to run through and pick it up simultaneously and go with it. And the same thing, you're gonna see the same thing come up with the recommendations of Meredith Street. We took that as far as we could within the guidelines of the LFA process, and it identifies a whole scope of what needs to be done. And now we just have to find a place where we can put that so somebody can develop that further and get the money and funding into that. Same idea. We've used all the resources we can within our guidelines under this process, but it doesn't mean we don't have other resources in different areas.
Do we have a plan when Seals Brook gets to the Delaware River to remove all of it, all the, we'll say debris that has come down, stones, rocks and everything? It has raised the river north of that at least 2.5 feet, maybe 3. I have a place on 91 Main Street, and I don't think that my place on 91 Main Street is over 4 foot above water level where they put in the next boat landing. I'd like to see that removed. That's number one. You talk about flooding the houses in Delhi, we got a natural dam down there that's impounding the water, and you can talk all about Elm Street. You got the whole village at risk because we're not taking care of that. It comes in as a T intersection. Go down and look. We have another big storm, it may shut it off, who knows? But it certainly should be removed, and I don't think it needs an awful lot of engineering to take the rocks out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
So put that on your thing, would you, and look at it?
Sure.
These bridges are all good, but that's the whole town you're looking at,
Mm-hmm.
not just Elm Street.
Well, one thing that we can do is that we have, what we do is we make these informed decisions. And so it's very, that problem we see a lot in Broome County. We've tackled a couple of these problems. We have Park Creek that comes into the Susquehanna. Huge gravel bar that's formed. you know, just as the tributary is just dumping all its load right there. And the community was concerned that it was basically acting as an impediment to flow. And so what we did is we took the existing hydraulic model that was available, and then we augmented it with some cross sections, basically some topography through the block, and then ran it in the model and kind of see, well, what is the conditions of the water during with the block in place, and then if we were to move it out of the way, what's our drop in water surface elevation.